Sunday, I'm either wearing contacts or glasses like I am today. And the reason I wear them is because I have myopia. That's what my optometrist tells me. And myopia means nearsightedness. That means that I can see pretty well right here in front of me. But if I take my glasses off, I don't see a lot of you, especially near the back, very well. And I was thinking about that whole idea of myopia because I've noticed that not just in my eyesight physically, but also in my spiritual eyesight, I have myopia a lot of times. I'm able to just see what's right up close to me pretty well, but I can't see very far away as well. I don't see as clearly. And the Lord wants to change that, and that's why He came to earth, is He wants to teach us how to see farther away than just this life here. And I want to invite you to open your Bibles to Matthew 6, 19 through 20, as he talks about this today. Matthew 6, 19 through 21, those three verses. It's about a fourth of the way back in your Bibles, and if you're using one of the black Bibles, there should be some near you, hopefully in a seat rack nearby. And if you pull that out, it's on page 787, Matthew 6, 19 through 21. Now, while you're turning there, we've just been in a series, this is the last week of the series called Transformed, Not Conformed. And the reason we're in this series is to understand that the Lord wants to change our minds so that we're not as conformed to the world, but transformed, be like Jesus, to think like Jesus. And Romans 12:2 is that verse that says, "Do not be conformed to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." So as we think about that, well, how does the Lord want to change our mind? Because often the way He changes our behavior is by changing our mind first, so that then we want to do what He talks to us about. So as we look at that, if you're following along in the notes, here's what we've looked at so far, is that Jesus' vision is that we be salt and light in this world with Him. Jesus' vision is that when He came to us, when He saved us from ourselves and our sin, His goal was not just to take us to heaven, but that we'd be salt and light in this world with Him, that we'd actually make a difference, be part of His redemptive healing work in the world. But again, sometimes all I have is a nearsighted perspective about that. And so He wants to transform us so that we have an eternal perspective. Now, last week, Steve talked to us about how he wants to change everything, the way we think, including the way we think about money. So if you're following along, notice this week we're going to finish by talking about this. He came to transform the way we think of and manage money. He came to transform the way we think of and manage money. And Steve talked to us last week about being stewards. That idea is that everything I have belongs to God, and that He's entrusted it to me, that I might steward it the way He wants my life, all of it. And then he also said something I thought was interesting. He said, oftentimes we try and separate or categorize out financial money management and spiritual life. And he says, no, Jesus comes along and says, no. I've come to transform the way you think of everything, including money, and the way you manage it. And so as we think about this today, I want to talk to you about having an eternal perspective, not myopia, but an eternal perspective about money, because it can change the way we think and look at it. Now, there's several things that I can mention here, but I want to just say a couple things. If you were to ask me, I've been a pastor for over 30 years, if you were to ask me, as I look back and evaluate the things that I've led or been a part of that I have no regrets about, it would be that since 1997, we have taught almost every year without fail on wise money management in this church. Schools aren't teaching anymore. Parents aren't often teaching anymore. Who teaches it? And so we've tried to be a church that, again, deals with that subject, not just about giving, but about wise money management, all of it. And it's changed a lot of people's lives. The stories that I've read and heard, and some of you have talked to me about, getting out of debt, being able to buy your own home, being able to give to God's work in the world, being able to learn how to tithe, and all these other things, saving money for the future, all that's been really gratifying. And again, we're offering the Financial Peace University class again. And if you want to sign up for it, I think there's some information in the bulletin. And also you can stop by the Ministry Center desk today and sign up for it. It's helped so many people, so I highly recommend Dave Ramsey's teaching on that. Another thing that we've done is, as I said, we've taught about it. If you're interested, I don't have time today to talk to you about a financial plan and those things, but if you want to listen to one of the past messages, I might recommend January 20th, 2013. If you go to our website and look at the message archives, January 20th, 2013, talks about some basics of having a plan. And then one more thing, there is a book that's really influenced my thinking even about this message. I read it years ago. I reread it again this week. I've probably read it 4 or 5 times. It's a little booklet, so you can do that. But here's how it used to look until the last couple of years when it was revised and updated. But Randy Alcorn wrote The Treasure Principle. And again, this is what it looks like now if you were to buy the newer copy, The Treasure Principle. It's orange there. And it's just so helpful. But some of you tell me that you're not necessarily readers. So what if I tell you that Right Now Media, the subscription that we've given to every person in this church, that there are 4 17-minute teachings that he gives on this that you can find on Right Now Media. So if you go to your Right Now Media subscription and you type in search Randy Alcorn, this orange icon will come up that says Treasure Principle, and you'll see 4 lessons that are really helpful, and I recommend that as well. So that's enough for that. Let me just say that before we unpack this passage, why do we need this message? Well, I was thinking about my own life. When I was a little kid, I went to Sunday school. My parents took me to Sunday school, and we had in our church out in Iowa there when I was a little boy, a retired missionary. She was in her 70s or 80s by that time, and one day she came to teach our children's class, and I had so much respect for this lady. And she told a story about how in another country there had been a witch doctor that had blinded this poor little child that had an eye problem because the witch doctor had suggested they put strong pepper juice in this kid's eyes, and it blinded the child. And so she went on to say, look, there's a lot of teaching like the witch doctors in other countries, and Jesus comes and he changes people and he shows them there's a better way. And missionaries can carry this good news if you'll help them. And so I went home, and in those days I had a 25-cent allowance. I remember this pretty clearly. And the missionary had said, what if you found a way to give silent money in your boxes? And so I asked my parents if I could have a 4-week advance on my allowance. And I remember giving that dollar in the early 60s and just thinking, wow, man, I want to be part of something. And I thought, now, where am I? Have I gotten more sophisticated? Have I suddenly still developed a case of myopia? Now at a time in my life where I have more resources than I've ever had? What am I learning now? And so this is an ongoing lesson. And this last week we met with a consultant that told us that the 5 top concerns in our community, did you know that 2 of them have to do with money? That people are concerned about long-term financial security in our community. And the other top concern of the 5 is daily financial worries. People think about this all the time. It's in our face all the time. And so how do we look at money? How do we think of it properly? Well, Jesus really gives some tremendous counsel here. He gives us an eternal perspective instead of a myopic one. And so I want to just pray now, and then we're going to look at this passage. But here's one more thought. Why we need this message is because, friends, we are the richest nation in the world. We have the possibilities of being salt and light in this world. I did it again this year. I told you before about globalrichlist.com. If you go there and you type in your annual household income, you can see where you are as far as the wealthy of the world. Did you know that if you make $20,000, you're in the top 10%? I think 20 or 25,000, you're in the top 10% of the richest people in the world. And many of us make far more than that. But just notice that that's a responsibility as well as a privilege. So how do Americans steward our money? Do we give a lot to charity and people in needs in the world? Here's what the average giving of an American is of their income. 2 to 3%. Now, how much do you think Christians give in the United States? You want to see that figure? Average Christian gives 2 to 3% to charity. We're not necessarily different than the world. We don't necessarily look at money any differently than our unbelieving neighbors. And God wants to change that. He wants us to see, the unbelievable potential if we'll listen to Jesus. So let me pray, and then we'll look at it. Now, God, I pray that as it has so many times in the past, that you would help us see further. You would help us see better. You would change and renew our minds so we would see the unbelievable opportunities that are set before us, and that we would be filled with joy, and that you would change us from the inside out. I just thank you so much for this church family already that listens to messages like these and takes them to heart. Oh God, bless every person that listens now. In your name I ask. Amen. Okay, I'm going to ask you to read verse 20 and 21 when we get to it. But I'll read verse 19. Here we go. Jesus says, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moths and vermin destroy and where thieves break in and steal." Would you read verse 20 with me in that first gray box? "But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where moth and rust do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal." And if you drop down to the second gray box, let's read verse 21 as well. "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Now, notice that Jesus in verse 19 and verse 20 offers two investment plans, ways to manage any treasure, any money, any possessions that come our way. And the first one, he doesn't necessarily recommend, but he says, look, when money or possessions come your way, you have a choice of what to do with it. There's investment plan number one and investment plan number two. So let's look at the first investment plan. He says, again, I'm not recommending this, but stack it up here on earth is one investment plan. You can store or stack it up here on earth. Now, the word there, store up for yourselves, the idea of store up, literally means to stack or to stockpile. It means beyond your needs, you just get into stockpiling, hoarding, just gathering as much as you can. And so, again, a very common thing is we're told all the time is that you win if you get the most that you can. And Jesus is just saying, I wouldn't recommend that investment plan. And here's why. If you're following along, earthly treasures aren't bad. In other words, some people go, oh, Jesus is against stuff. Jesus is against money. No, not at all. He's saying earthly treasures aren't bad, but they won't last. Do you notice his reasoning? Do you notice what he says? He says, look, here's why. Because if you store it up here on earth, moths, rats, thieves can all get it. And you can lose it. It won't necessarily last. The other thing we've all learned is that sooner or later, it's going to either go out of style, it's going to wear out, it can be taken from us. There's lots of different ways. It's vulnerable. He's just saying, if you're going to stockpile that stuff, the chances of you being able to do that without it either being taken or at least becoming less meaningful to you is just not possible. So, again, notice this. So thinking this way, according to Jesus, thinking this way isn't simply wrong, it's foolish. Thinking this way isn't simply wrong. He's going, don't do that because that's bad. It's not what he's saying as much as he's saying, look, it's just stupid. I mean, if you think it out, it's just not a smart way to live. And you know what, friends? Jesus is reasoning with us. He's saying, look, even people that don't believe a word I say know this. It's just not the smartest way to live. And so he tells this parable in Luke 12 that I've found fascinating. Maybe you've read it before. But he said to them, watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. And when Jesus says this, he knows that our hearts can be drawn to all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. Oh, really, Jesus? The world I live in says so. And he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. Then he said, this is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I'll store my surplus grain, and I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich towards God. What does that mean? Did you notice that not once did he ever factor God into any of his decision making? He didn't acknowledge that it came from God. He didn't acknowledge that God might have other ideas about how he could actually administer that and steward that. It just never factored in. Here's what I'll do. I'll build my barns, all this kind of stuff. And he never, ever factored in. And that very night, he was going to die. What use would it be to him then? And so God says, you fool. And he's not being mean-spirited. He's going, that was not a smart, wise way to live. And so that's investment plan number one. And I don't know about you, but I don't need to talk about that rich farmer. Just talk about myself. I find that this is in my face all the time. I stepped into my closet this week, and I looked at the different clothes I have, and I thought, man, I'm thankful for all these clothes. And I wonder why when I go to a store, I still am interested in other clothes. And I wonder, like, what's going to happen to these clothes? When I was a teenager, I was making money at a grocery store, and so with one of my 2-week paychecks, I went out and bought a pair of designer jeans that I thought were the coolest ones at the time. They had braids on the side. I walked around looking like Antonio Banderas. And I thought to myself the other day, I probably only wore those about 20 times, and I wonder where they are now. I guarantee you they're not still in style. But there's something about that at the time that I just thought, oh my goodness. And I realized that, there's nothing wrong with clothes and stuff like that. In fact, when Jesus talks about this, he was saying, most people in those days poured their money into clothes. That was their form of wealth. But moths could eat that. Mice can eat your grain. They can steal stuff. So investment plan number one. So anybody interested in investment plan number two? Verse 20, here it is. Store up for yourself in heaven. In other words, store up treasure for yourself in heaven. Now this has bothered some people when they read this because they go, he says in verse 19, do not store up for yourselves treasure on earth. But then he turns around and says, but store up for yourselves treasure in heaven. He can't mean that. That sounds self-centered. But Jesus is saying, look, I understand that you want your life to be rich and filled. And that's not wrong. I made you to have those kind of desires. But your motivation and the location of where you want those things makes a difference. Therefore, don't put it on something that's vulnerable. Put it in something that's going to last and be even more meaningful than any material pleasure could ever bring you. And so he says, do that. Store it up for yourself. It's enlightened self-interest. But again, it takes some explanation. So let me just unpack this. This is what Randy Alcorn says is the treasure principle. Are you ready for this next sentence? You can't take it with you, but you can send it on ahead. You can't take it with you, but you can send it on ahead. John D. Rockefeller in the early 1900s was by far and away the wealthiest person in the United States and probably the world. And when he died, someone was asking his accountant, because they were getting the news story on this, how much did he leave? And the accountant looked back and said, he left it all. And they were expecting some big dollar amount. He left it all. That's why you never see a hearse pulling a U-Haul. No matter what it means to you now, you can't take it with you. King Tut tried to take it with him, and we get to see it on display today. You can't take it with you. But here's the good news. You can't send that on ahead. If you hold on to it here, you can lose it. But you can send it on ahead and never lose it. And so he goes on and says this. Make deposits in an account you can't lose. This is the whole idea. Make deposits in an account you can't lose. This is in other places in the New Testament as well. But did you ever read in Philippians 4:17, the Apostle Paul is thanking the Philippian church in the letter to the Philippians for their generous gift to support his ministry, because he depended on support like that as well as being a tent maker. And they sent him a gift, and he knew they didn't have to do it. But he's writing to thank them, and here's what he says. This is a good passage, by the way. Not that I desire your gifts. In other words, I'm not writing to get more out of you. Not that I desire your gifts. What I desire is that more be credited to your account. Do you realize, friends, when you and I trust Christ, he not only saves us and begins to prepare a place in heaven, he actually opens a heavenly bank account with your name on it. And he begins to make the deposits of what you and I give to him, so that he is storing it up in heaven on our behalf. And one day, we're going to see the payoff of that as we work with him. All because he's that generous. I mean, just saving us in itself would have been incredible. But that's how generous he is. And so Jesus says in different places, here's how you take something here on earth and you store it up in heaven. So here's Luke 12, verse 33. Look at what he says. He says, sell your possessions and give to those in need. Now, does he say sell all your possessions? No. He only said that to one guy in the New Testament. And he knew that's because the guy had an idol with his money. But here's what happens. Sell your possessions. So the early Christians did this. They looked at some of their stuff and they looked at it and said, that could actually go to a different purpose, or I could share that. Sell your possessions and give to those in need. This will store up treasure for you in heaven. And the purses of heaven never get old and don't develop holes. Your treasure will be safe. No thief can steal it and no moth can destroy it. He's just going, look, you can actually do that. Wow, you can send it on ahead. You can make deposits. You can't lose. Now here's what I want you to see too. Whatever you give to Jesus increases in value. Whatever you give to Jesus increases in value. Some of you appreciate A.W. Tozer. Here's what he once wrote. As base a thing as money often is, it yet can be converted into everlasting treasure. It can be converted into food for the hungry and clothing for the poor. It can keep a missionary actively winning lost people to the light of the gospel and thus convert itself into heavenly values. Any temporal possession can be turned into everlasting wealth. Whatever is given to Christ is immediately touched with immortality. I love this. Out to the right of that passage, when I just said, whatever you give to Jesus increases in value, I list a couple of passages, but I'll just talk about one. It's one of my favorites. In John 6, there is a crowd of 5,000, we read. And we often think it was only 5,000, but it says just men, not counting women and children. So this is a big crowd. And Jesus is realizing he needs to feed these people because they weren't like us. They lived hand to mouth. They were basic sustenance living. And so he saw that if they tried to go home, they would be exhausted on the way. So he said, how do I feed these guys? And here comes a little boy who has a little lunch of 5 loaves and 2 fish. And he looks up to Jesus and he goes, you can have it. And you go, I don't think that's going to get it done. You know what got it done? Once Jesus touched it, it immediately increased in value. And I, for one, have noticed that if I can get things in Jesus' hands, they immediately multiply and increase in value. The question is, can I get it out of my hands into his hands? As often where the sight can be in our hearts. And so, as we think about that, here's another thing that I think oftentimes we object. And here's the truth. We can do this no matter how little you have or how young you are. You can do this no matter how little you have or how young you are. In our church, I'm so thankful that children, youth, and adults have all thought about things like this before. A few years ago, when we were helping Fresh Visions Community Church by trying to join them and helping them get started building their new building, I received a letter from Pastor Roy Newman one day. I didn't know anything about this, but there was a girl in our church who at that time said, what can I do? And she said, I may not have as much as my mom and dad, I may not have as much as other people, but she thought, well, I know at birthday time, people give me gifts. And this year, instead of asking for gifts, I'm going to ask that they give money to Fresh Visions Community Church so they can build their building. And this pastor writes me and says, did you know that one of your parishioners, that one of my parishioners, this person is a follower of Jesus? And they thought about how they could do that, and they didn't say, well, I don't have much. No, they said, what can I do? Doesn't matter how old I am. It doesn't matter whether I have a little or a lot. And many people say, when I get a lot, then I'll give. But do you know what those same things show? And I found this struggle in my own heart. The more people are given in the United States, the more they earn, their percentage drops in how much they give. It doesn't go up. That shows that there's a battle in our hearts. It also shows that there's many people that say, well, I don't have much, so then they use that as an excuse not to do anything, and they miss the opportunity. So it's a challenge no matter what your situation is. This is an ongoing dilemma we have to all face. And I found myself This month is a time when I always look at my taxes and I look at what I've given in the previous year, Trish and I, and we review. Has the percentage of what we give gone up or stayed the same, gone down? How are we responding, God? The more you prosper, the more treasures come our way. So this is the battle. But notice this. Here's the secret. If you want to know the secret of becoming a generous person. And in 2 Corinthians 8, I'm going to unpack that in a second, but here it is. Give yourself first to the Lord and then to others. Give yourself first to the Lord and then to others. The order is absolutely critical. Here's why. Let's say you say, I'm going to give myself to others and maybe to the Lord. Well, what happens is if those people you give to disappoint you or misuse what you gave them, you'll be resentful. But if you give it to the Lord first, then no matter what they do with it, you'll still be able to go, Lord, it was yours. It's your problem now. Your money. And that's such a different attitude. So give yourself first to the Lord. Look at 2 Corinthians 8. This passage has inspired me. And Paul wrote, because there was a famine in Jerusalem. So some of the other churches in other parts of the world heard about that famine and said, how can we collect an offering and send it so our brothers and sisters in Jerusalem can have food, even though they're going through a time of shortage? So here's what he writes to the Corinthian church in 2 Corinthians 8. Now I want you to know, dear brothers and sisters in Corinth, what God in his kindness has done through the churches in Macedonia. They are being tested by many troubles, and they are very poor, but they are also filled with abundant joy, which has overflowed in rich generosity. For I can testify that they gave not only what they could afford, but far more. And they did it of their own free will. They begged us again and again for the privilege of sharing in the gift for the believers in Jerusalem. They did even more than we had hoped. For their first action was to give themselves to the Lord and then to us, just as God wanted them to do. And when you see that, you begin to say, okay, what happened to them? What changed their minds? What gave them instead of saying, look, we're broke, hope somebody else helps you. They go, no, we know what it feels like. We can do something. We'll figure out a way. Please let us be part of this. Please do not look down on us because we don't have a lot. Let us do something. And they found a way. But what happened? He goes on in verse 9 and explains the secret. You know the generous grace of our Lord Jesus Christ. But though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, so that by his poverty he could make you rich. See, their hearts were changed by the grace of Jesus towards them. They realized that the penalty of their sin, their moral bankruptcy, they could never pay on their own. But Jesus left the glories of heaven to pay for their penalty and pay for their debt. And they thought, if he would be willing to do that, that just melts my heart. And if you follow along in the notes, notice that Jesus' grace melts our hearts to ask better questions. Jesus' grace melts our heart to ask better questions. This is what I've seen happen in my life, and it probably happened in yours. But this idea is that instead of saying, what can't I do? Or, oh, they're just so much more impressive than me. They have more. I just go, no, that's wrong. That's not a better question. A better question is, what can I do, Lord? Show me. And when you begin to say, what can I do? You get on the solution side, and things begin to release in your life. And that's what the Macedonian Christian. What did the rich farmer say? What shall I do? Period. Question mark. But these people ask, what shall we do, Lord? And that question changed everything. You know, I've seen this in all kinds of practical ways. Some of you have told me that you're Starbucks addicts, you know. And so every once in a while you stood back and said, look, all the money I'm spending on coffee, what if for a month I was just to take that same money and use it for God's work in the world? And you've done it. Again, is there anything wrong with enjoying Starbucks? No. Some of you have said, hey, we were going to use this money for a vacation. What if we used it for a mission trip for our family? I've watched people that they start asking questions and they start seeing opportunities that they'd missed before because they thought, well, I can't be like them or like them, and comparing it. Those are terrible questions. What can I do? And God, let me just do what I can do. And then notice that our treasure management shows what our heart wants most. Treasure management shows what our heart wants most. Did you notice what Jesus says? For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. In other words, your heart will always follow what's most important to you. What you think about, what you invest your money and possessions in, it'll get your heart. And so what Jesus is saying here, listen to what Randy Alcorn says again. He says, show me your checkbook, your visa statement, and your receipts, and I'll show you where your heart is, Jesus is saying. As surely as the compass needle follows north, your heart will follow your treasure. Money leads, hearts follow. He says, I've heard people say, I always wanted a heart for missions. So I respond, Jesus tells you exactly how to get it. Put your money in missions and in your church and in the poor, and your heart will follow. Do you wish you cared more about eternal things? Then reallocate some of your money. In fact, most of your money, if you're willing, from temporal things to eternal things, and watch what happens. Because God wants our hearts. So as we think about this before communion, how can we let him renew our minds? From the way that we may think about this, to the way that he wants to change us and make us more like this. Here's just a couple thoughts. First, let him change the questions I ask. The questions I ask if you're following along. And the question I keep coming back to again and again, I told you about what I was like as a little boy when I was touched by that missionary story and touched by what God might be able to do in another country. I remember that it was because I wanted Jesus to have my heart. But I noticed that that's not just a one-time thing, that's an everyday thing. And so when I was 15, I gave him my heart. When I was 17, I gave him my heart. And sometimes, I've noticed that sometimes I'll go for days without freshly saying, you have my heart. However you want to steer it, however you want to turn it, you've got my heart. Because if you've got my heart, you've got my wallet. And I want you to have my heart. But there's days that I don't give him my heart. And I've watched how that goes down. And it's different. And the questions I ask, like, Lord, what can I do? You know, when something comes my way, he wants me to say, look, what can that same possession, what can that same amount of money do for someone else? Or do you want me to share it? Do you want me to enjoy it? Do you want me to spend it on our family? Whatever it might be, but letting the Lord have our heart. And then the last thing is this, is where home is. Let Jesus renew our minds as far as where home is. Am I living for here or there? Am I living for here or there? You know the Bible tells us that this world's not our home, right? You know you're going to spend a lot more time in eternity than here, right? And if that's the case, what's the wisest way of how we spend time? I mean, there's a guy in our church that has next to his computer this saying, what matters most in the end matters most now. What matters most in the end matters most now. It helps him have an eternal perspective. And so he begins to see how he can live now for them, for that place, for heaven, where Jesus is, where people that Jesus has saved are. And so, as I think about this, let me just say a couple things. One, I just appreciate you as a church. You blow me away. This week I just went through my mind all the different ways I've seen some of you take this to heart. I watched some of you sacrifice, for us to move out here 11 years ago. I don't know if you know this, but some families cashed out and they gave sacrificially. So last Sunday, watching 11 people be baptized, I remember that we just sensed God was asking us to make room. And we all agreed to put everything back on the table and say, Jesus, whatever you tell me to take off, I'll take off and give to you. And a whole bunch of you did. And Trish and I got to be part of that rocket ride too. And I just want to tell you, when I go to different fundraising banquets for different ministries and missions, I often see a whole bunch of Cherry Hills people there. And so I know that far beyond what you may give to this church, you give to different ministries individually in different ways, and missions and orphans and foster care and homeless people and all kinds of things I could say. Way to go. Let's keep learning. Let's keep growing. But the other thing is I had to think about, how do I apply this? Because doesn't this feel huge? Doesn't this feel like almost too much to think about? So this week I was reading through the Bible, Matthew 25. We're reading through the New Testament. And last week Steve taught on the parable of the talents. Well, right after the parable of the talents is the parable of the sheep and the goats. And it's that famous passage where Jesus says, I tell you, whatever you did for the least of these my brothers, you did for me. And as I'm reading that, I'm thinking, okay, he talks about the hungry, the thirsty, the stranger, the naked, the sick, and the imprisoned. And I'm thinking, okay, but this one hit me. I had never seen a certain word. When the Christians said to him, Lord, when do we do that? And he said, whenever you did it for one of the least of these, my brothers and sisters. I'd never seen the word one before. I'd always heard a group. So I always thought, man, I'm not doing enough. And the Lord just said to me this week, just do for one. Just do for one. Have you ever tried to write? I've written a lot of letters over the years. And I've noticed that sometimes when I want to tell someone how much they mean to me, I wait till I can write a big, long letter and tell them everything on my heart. And I noticed that I never get around to that. Barely ever. But when I started changing my perspective and said, what if I just wrote one short note where all I try to do is write one sentence or two sentences? I've noticed that if I start there, my heart is usually more than ready to write another sentence or two. But if I think big, I don't get much done. So here's what I think the Lord's saying this week. How can you and I do for one person that he puts on our hearts so that we can transfer money and possessions from earth to heaven? If that happens, friends, if each one of us do that, can you imagine what will happen this week in the kingdom of God? Let's pray. Now, Lord, so grateful for this church. Remind us this world is not our home, but just a passing through. Help our hearts not to get attached to this world and all the things that we can get here. And help us to see them so that we enjoy them, but we don't be enslaved to them. Show us how, Lord, to invest ourselves in your kingdom and in people that will last forever. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Now, whenever we celebrate communion here, we do it once a month, and on the first Sunday usually of each month. And so if you're a guest here and you've never taken communion before, you may wonder, should I take it? Well, if you have trusted Christ, even if you're not part of our church, please, when the trays come your way, please feel like God is inviting you to take it as well. And if you've never turned from going your own way and put your trust in Jesus Christ and what he's accomplished and done for you on the cross, do you realize that today you could do that very thing right where you're sitting? But if you're not ready to do that, we respect that. We would just ask that you let the tray pass and think about your relationship with Jesus. Again, we're just glad you're here. But the most important thing is whether or not you've let Jesus make you right with God and that you come into a relationship with him. That's what he wants for all of us. So, again, in just a few moments, these gentlemen will serve these trays with double cups of bread and grape juice. If you can hold on to them so we can all take them together, then I'll give the signal when we can do that. And here's how we can use this time. Jesus says, every time you do this, remember me. Remember that I made you my treasure, and I gave myself generously to you. And let that touch your heart again as you take communion so that you can become a giver instead of a hoarder. Let it open your heart and enlarge the size of your heart. And so let's think about Jesus and what he's done for us.